Do you enjoy browsing Zillow to look at homes you can't afford? Who doesn't? But you probably noticed that the number of houses you can't afford is going up. In fact, in March of 2020, the average home in the US sold for $329,000. Today, that number is over $428,000, and that is a 30% increase in just 2 years. In just the past year, the average home price has grown by over 15%, which is a larger return than both the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. It looks like we're about to enter yet another housing crisis. And the question is, will millions of young Americans ever be able to move out of their parents' house and get a home of their own? Because according to the latest survey data, more than half of all millennials feel like that's never gonna happen. The question is, why? And there's usually 3 excuses given. Things like population growth, lack of supply, and of course, corporate greed are some of the most popular. And while these reasons seem to make sense, it turns out none of them can effectively explain the bubble we find ourselves in. Now, while it's true that some parts of the country are booming with population, we can't blame population growth as a whole because population growth has flatlined over the last 2 years. And a good example of this is West Virginia, which, despite having a falling population, the state's housing market has risen roughly 20% in the last 2 years. What about supply? Well, it turns out, and this is a shocker, there isn't less land to build on than there was 2 years ago. And there aren't fewer materials to build with. And while supply chain problems have grown worse over the past year, that doesn't explain why home prices began to surge before COVID. So what about corporate greed? The internet is filled with articles blaming Wall Street or large-scale rental property owners like BlackRock for soaring home prices. And it seems to be one of the few arguments that both the left and right agree on. But BlackRock and Wall Street alone cannot explain a 30% jump in prices. Consider this, out of the roughly 80 million single-family homes in the US, just 300,000 are owned by institutional investors. And BlackRock's share of that is less than 3%. So, if none of these answers effectively explain the sudden increase in costs, then what exactly has caused the massive jump in home prices? Well, I'll give you a hint. It's the same group of people that largely created the last housing bubble, although this time they were even less creative. If you guessed politicians, you'd be correct. Because last time, the housing bubble included Congress and the president deliberately interfering in the housing market through the encouragement of ridiculous lending practices, which were, of course, backed by your tax dollars. This time, politicians locked down the entire economy, and then the Federal Reserve attempted to jumpstart it by printing $5 trillion. In short, the government at one level is restricting supply through regulations, taxes, and building codes, while artificially increasing demand through inflationary monetary policy. So while there are a ton of factors that go into rising housing costs, bubbles of this kind always include politicians arrogantly meddling with things they don't understand. So back to our question. Will millennials ever be able to afford a home of their own? Yes, most likely. But unfortunately, it's probably not going to happen until yet another government-induced housing bubble bursts, and a lot of people are hurt in the process.